Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn 1303rd New Social Environment. I'm Magali, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Glenn Adamson, Severin Delfs, and Jessica Holmes. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Glenn Adamson is a curator, writer, and historian based in New York and London. The author most recently of A Century of Tomorrows. He is currently curator at large for the Vitra Design Museum in Germany, artistic director for Design Doha, a biennial festival in Qatar, and editor of Material Intelligence, the quarterly online journal published by Chipstone Foundation. Severin Delfs is director of development at Hollis Taggart and a legacy steward of the Audrey Flack Foundation in the state. He has collaborated curatorially with the Parish Art Museum and Longhouse Reserve Sculpture Garden and Museum Reserve Landscape. Other projects include the exhibitions Codes and Colors, Teruko Yokoi, No Theater, and John Graham Comes Home in collaboration with the Brooklyn Home Company. And our host today, Jessica Holmes, a co-editor of the ArtSeen section for the Brooklyn Rail, has also contributed to its pages for over a decade. Her writing has featured in Bomb, Hyperallergic, The New York Observer, Vanity Fair Spain, among many others, and has been included in over 24 exhibition catalogs and monographs. Previously, Jessica worked for the Calder Foundation for nearly 2 decades, including 6 years as its deputy director. And with that, I will hand it over to Jessica to get us started.
Great. Magli, thank you so much. And thank you, Glenn, Severin, and Susan for being here today. And thanks to everybody out there who is watching and listening. I'm really excited to get going. And before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know that this Saturday there will be a curatorial walkthrough of both venues of the exhibition, which is open to the public. It will begin at Susan Inglett's gallery at 11 a.m. at 522 West 24th Street, and then continue on at Hollis Taggart at 521 West 26th Street. So if you enjoy today and would like to hear more and possibly interact with some of the artists, I encourage you to attend the walkthrough on Saturday. Um, and with that, I'd love to begin talking about drop cloth with you, Glenn and Severin. I thought perhaps we could begin with a little background to the show, how the idea originated, and perhaps some of the historical backdrop.
Yeah, great, Jessica. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you all. Seven and I are going to take turns walking through the majority of the show, and then Susan Inglett will join us towards the end to talk about of the artists that are on view at her gallery. I guess for me personally, just speaking for myself, the exhibition really did come out of an art historical interest initially. So we've got a few slides here just to kind of get into the topic. As I'm sure everyone listening and watching will be aware, drapery and fabric, textile is an extremely important part of art history, not only in its own right in the form of tapestry, weaving, embroidery, etc., but also as a subject of painting and sculpture. And one of the things that interested me was to create an exhibition that took account of the growth of interest in fiber art that's been happening recently. This is something we'll get back to later, I think. But sort of reversed the polarity and thought about how painting was looking at fabric as opposed to how textile artists might be looking at fine art. But once you start thinking about it, you realize that in addition to the visual presence that textile has in historical art, and this is a great example, the still life. Of course, we also see fabric in portraiture, we see it in genre painting, we see it in history painting, and we also see it very interestingly in almost as a kind of demonstration of skill by artists. One thing that you immediately start to realize is that because textile is not only very visually captivating, just because of the way it falls and the kind of shapes that it makes, which almost amount to a kind of proto-abstraction, and something very interesting about the way that artists would represent textiles in ways that are perhaps more free of the duty of mimesis than other aspects of the picture. And again, simply demonstrating their skill. But also, as we saw in the last image, there's a very strong sense that the artists know their textiles very well because textiles were such an extreme concentration of value. And of course, people in the Renaissance or the 17th century would have understood textiles in a way that most contemporary people do not, because the technology and the quality, the implications of class, the associations with place were so strong in people's minds. So for all those reasons, there's a very, very rich backdrop for artists who are going to think about painting in relation to textile. But we were really particularly interested to begin the story in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when you have a generation of artists who begin seizing on textile not only as a subject, but also as a medium in its own right, and start to think about ways that textile and painting can have a co-presence in the work. And two artists that for me were very, very significant in this respect were Nina Jankowicz, whose work you see here. This all the works that we're showing in the slides are in the exhibition. And there's a great image of Jankowicz in her studio dropping a cloth, literally drop cloth. This is one of the images that was in my head when Susan suggested the great title for our show. So this idea of cloth sort of taking its own form, taking action in a sort of post-minimal process art context. And just the fact that she had this photograph taken in her studio shows how interested she was in the fact that a seemingly simple rectangle of fabric can take on this almost infinitely complex, infinitely variable, malleable form, and then be addressed in terms of its surface through what was effectively color field painting. Jankowicz, not nearly as well known as Sam Gilliam, who is maybe the first artist that comes to mind when thinking about the unstretched, sculptural, color field oriented textile engagement of that time. But actually, Jankowicz and Gilliam were developing these ideas very much in parallel and at the same time. And as you can see, very similar kind of atmospheric effects that come out of the work of artists like Helen Frankenthaler, looking further back to abstract expressionism, but begin to bring those pictorial and formal effects out into space. So that's a lot of preamble, but I do want to say something important, which is that my own personal way of getting into all of that was actually through the work of my own partner, Nicola Stephanie, who's a painter. She's with me here in London now. But when we were in New York together, she had been developing a body of work that is based on close observation of textiles that she would either acquire or in some cases had familial connections to. And what she's been doing is painting them in these extremely suggestive, I think very formally powerful ways that are also very attentive to the specific quality of cloth. And one of the things that she's really taught me, in addition to all of this very compelling art historical backdrop, which really comes out of her own research, is the way that textile performs a key role in forming identity. And so this painting, for example, Alba, presents the idea of a skirt that's on the floor as if it perhaps has been discarded or might be about to be put on. And you're not even necessarily sure what you're looking at when you first encounter the image. It almost looks like a mandala or a kind of portal to another world. As I said, it feels abstract and representational at the same time. So it has this kind of double identity. And this idea that textile has a strong relationship to gendered and other forms of identity that are always in formation and involve a certain degree of performativity or transformation is really important to her work, but also important to the show in general. So that's another thing that I think has really come out of her thinking that really pervades the exhibition. And here's another work of hers more recent, which is called Pink Pink. And this is quite small. It's maybe just, a foot in on each side, whereas the previous painting is quite a large monumental one. But the intimacy of this and the way that she's introducing you or almost inviting you into the folds of this garment that you can't quite identify. And again, this idea of a kind of portal or an opening or aperture into another world that you, again, might not even identify at first as being cloth at all until you realize, oh, that must be a tag, and you're seeing seams and you're seeing the folds and formations of the fabric. So this idea that textile is always in a process of becoming, and also that that becoming has a kind of indexical or symbolic relationship to identity and the transformation of identity. That seems very, very important as a kind of cultural backdrop to the exhibition. And these are ideas that maybe were not so present in the work of Gilliam and Yankowitz or other members of that generation, but certainly were being explored by others in the 1970s. And here we thought particularly of Rosemary Meyer, a really significant artist who unfortunately died tragically young, but a great writer. We'll actually hear something of hers at the end of the talk. And she was thinking a lot about the relationship between fabric and architecture, as you can see here in this other related work. We have both of these in the show again. And she's also very affiliated with the feminist art movement at that time. So here you have an artist who's very explicitly thinking about this soft, permeable, malleable, and manipulable veils and membranes of textile as being a sculptural material, a material for painting, and also a material for making space. And this is another thing that Nicola has thought a lot about and is very, I think, powerfully implied by Alba in particular, that first large scale image. You know, textile also is a terrain. And sometimes you don't have a sense of what the scale is. Is this a handkerchief or is it a massive drapery? That you're encountering in a picture in the show. But what you do know is that there's a topology and it creates a sense of place making. I suppose, alternative pathway through that generation, at least in terms of gender, would be John Chamberlain, an artist that both Severin and I have a lot of interest in. And he, of course, is best known for his work with steel, with materials from salvaged from automobiles, but he also has worked with foil and other lighter metal materials that are much closer to being fabric-like. And we were really interested to find this collage piece from the 1980s to include in the show. And it alludes, of course, to the whole expressionistic style in post-war sculpture, which we pick up in a few other artists that Severin will talk about later on. But here you have this very different valence into the idea of textiles, where it really is seemingly entirely about form and about mutation, perhaps, and it, has a very masculine quality, which you might not pick up on just from this work, but certainly you would be well aware of it from Chamberlain's other work. And yet there's a kind of delicacy, a lightness of touch, a sensitivity to color that counterbalances that seeming gender emphasis, in the same way that in Meyer's case, you have an artist who's very strongly affiliated with feminism, but is also thinking very architecturally and structurally. So starting to break down these easy assumptions or stereotypes of gender and using textile as a kind of connective tissue, almost a deconstructive technique to do that. And you probably can't think of a better example of an artist who's working with these forms in that way than Linda Benglis, who's, so many things going on in her work to do with process, and is probably best known for those pour works that she was making in the late 60s and early 70s, but has done so many other related and unrelated investigations into forms of making sense. And she's another person who's thought a lot about the way that an artwork can almost seem to be taking shape before your eyes. And so these ideas of scrunching or folding or unfurling in a whole variety of materials, from handmade paper to fabric to paint, and the way that she's working liberally with those materials and bringing them into relationship with one another, I think it really shows you how the idea of a shaped painting that started with Gilliam and Yankowitz developed through this kind of complex of different materials, with a very wide range of different cultural associations. And so we're kind of trying to tell the story of emergence of these strategies. And then I'll finish this first piece with just one last artist who's Al Held, and we have with us on the call, I think, Daniel Blasco, the head of the Al Held Foundation, who was super helpful in finding this work for us, Hawkeye from 1998. By Al Held standards, not a huge, not a huge painting. Those who know his practice know that he makes extremely large pictures more often than not, and this is a more manageable size for us. But it was also attractive to us because of the very strong sense of pleating and the kind of cascade of stripes and the idea of pattern that you're getting from the textile. Not something that I've mentioned earlier, but again, you see it in Nicola's painting Alba, the way that a pattern breaks down, multiplies, compounds itself, distorts because of the folding of the fabric, and how compelling that is to artists and always really has been. And what Held is doing remarkably seems to anticipate that this is a late painting, but if you know his work, he seemed to anticipate digital techniques for understanding distortion and the mapping of patterns across surfaces long before those techniques actually existed in the digital realm. He was somehow working them out intuitively in his own practice, very impressively. So these are all just some aspects of the kind of art historical backdrop for the show, and I hope it gives you some sense of the motivations that we had in mind when including some of these more recent historic figures, if I can call them that. Some of them, of course, like Nina, are still with us, but also the really long story or long art history in which the show takes place.
Thank you, Glenn. Excuse me. And I think this might be actually a good moment to draw you into the conversation, Severin, and talk about some of the painterly responses to drapery that are in this show.
Absolutely. And just to pick off where Glenn left it, there was a strong looking at the pleat, the fold, the drape as sort of a continuum and how it's affected practices throughout art history. So we were looking at a lot of contemporary practitioners as well as having this historic backdrop of where this curatorial concept came from. And I think there's no better segue than talking about Catherine Murphy, because although this is a work from 2024 and contemporary work, she was incredibly important in the late 60s and early 70s. She was, I think, one of the best observational painters of the last half century. And she was emerging at a time where the entire art landscape was almost completely abstract. A lot of the works we looked at the first half of the exhibition, historically, Nina Yankwitz, Sam Gilliam, they were exploring the concepts of drop cloth and the fold and the pleat and the form, but completely abstractly. So Catherine would have been one generation older than a lot of the early figurative practitioners, I'll call them. People like Philip Pearlstein and Alice Neal, and all these people were sort of fighting against abstraction and bringing realism and figuration back into contemporary thought. So I love seeing this lineage of, we go all the way back to the Renaissance and see how the cloth, the fold is sort of a proto-abstract arena, and where we start the exhibition in the late 60s, 70s, it's an entirely abstract arena. And it isn't until the mid 70s and 80s that we start seeing a return to figuration. So many of the contemporary artists you'll see in this list, some of them are abstract, some of them are representational, but I think Catherine Murphy is just a wonderful pivot point where representational art is sort of allowed in discourse again. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, I think Jenny Brillhart is a fantastic contemporary painter. And it reminds me of something you were saying in the first half as well, Glenn, where cloth would have had such a different meaning to artists of the Renaissance. It has to do with all sorts of social and class dynamics. I love this piece in particular by Jenny because fabric from the Lascaux house refers to her grandmother's house, which I believe was in Martha's Vineyard. Her grandmother was an obsessive fabric collector, um, and just had endless and endless amounts of these wonderful, beautiful fabrics, one of which you can see here. And Jenny has an entire series of depicting these fabrics in a painterly way. So I love the nuance of appreciating fabric for what it is, but then again, translating it on a two-dimensional plane. With Jenny, there's actually an in-between step because she photographs almost everything and then paints from a photograph. So it goes from fabric to photograph to canvas. But it's just this really beautiful depiction. I think really highlights the concepts of drop cloth quite well. Yeah, Jenny Morgan. If you see our catalog, she's right on the cover. We were very obsessed with the diaphanous quality in fabric. It's a big part of both of our essays if you have time to read them. There's something really, really fascinating about the translucent, the semi-opaque, the diaphanous quality in fabric. It sort of becomes a portal where you can see the form, the shape in the front, but oftentimes there is a mystery behind. And if you look closely at Jenny Morgan's painting, you can see just the slightest impression of a face, of eyes. Later, Susan will talk on another wonderful artist, Beverly Semmes, who also has a diaphanous quality to her work and sort of a portal that one can walk through or imagine oneself on the other side of. But again, the diaphanous quality was an element in our curatorial conversations that we wanted to explore in drop cloth. And I think Jenny's a great example of that. Paige Bieber, yeah. One thing, again, as we were looking at the lineage of the cloth, and the fold and the history behind it. And we'll talk about a few artists later. The pattern and design movement was this wonderful moment where textile art, fiber, a lot of creative domains that were previously known as women's work were vaulted into sort of the modernist mainstay of New York art discourse. And I love how in Paige Bieber's work, you see a lot of that history on full display. It's totally painted, but it brings together a lot of the concepts that went into this exhibition. There's elements of diaphanous, transparent qualities. I wish I could get this a little bigger, but there's a wonderful patterning. It's almost like quilt and collage. It's just a really fantastic work that I think brings together a lot of the curatorial concepts. Also, I don't know about you, but it reminds me a lot of the designer Mackenzie Childs.
Mm-hmm.
I just absolutely love that. I don't know if that was even in Paige's head when she was painting this, but again, another, I think it's an artist couple who was Mackenzie Childs, and they were heavily inspired by the pattern design movement. Mm. And now apparently live on a ferry somewhere, a houseboat somewhere in New York. It's a fascinating story. Google up the Mackenzie Childs story if you have a chance. But anyway, I digress. Kenichi Hoshine is just an absolutely spectacular painter. We're so fortunate to have him in the exhibition. I think he does a really great job at fluidly melding figural elements, gestural elements. There's slight whiffs of abstraction, of figuration, of landscape, and it all comes together in this really, really playful way. There's a lot of moods. There's a lot of narratives that you can kind of tease out, and all the while you're seeing similar historic influences. The pattern and design movement I just spoke of, abstract expressionism, and a lot of the sort of 70s and 80s realism and figuration that was coming back in style, all goes into Kenichi's thinking, and it's just a fantastic work.
And I think as we move into some of the textile artists, both Glenn and Severin, I just had a question for you both. Glenn made, I thought, a thoughtful point right at the outset of his catalog essay that since the 17th century, most paintings have been made on canvas, which itself is a woven substrate. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or could talk a little bit more, either of you, on this elemental connection between cloth and draping and painting.
Hmm. Well, this is actually the perfect slide to have on for that question because, of course, one thing Elaine Rychek is thinking about is the hierarchical relationship between uh, painting, which since the 17th century has been more often than not on canvas, though certainly not only, and textile media, in her case, embroidery is a preferred technique, although not her only one. Um, and one thing that this pair of works immediately brings to your attention is that the canvas is also a fabric, and she's using color as a way of highlighting that to your attention. But maybe before getting into Rychek's work more deeply, I think the fact that the canvas is as a substrate and as a material that's often covered all or in part, it almost literally spells out that quality of hierarchical arrangement that we can associate with the art versus crafts debate that has raged on for decades and centuries. One which I think we're finally in the liberated position of having transcended, but it's certainly taking a long time and is an incomplete process. Um, and in fact, maybe only is really happening within the narrow precincts of the art world. And maybe once you leave New York galleries and, museum exhibitions like the one that Lynn Cook recently did on textile art, it might be that the popular understanding of the relationship between, let's say, sewing and painting is still very charged with that kind of hierarchy. So the fact that canvas is always right there under the surface, literally, and being overlooked, um, I think is very symbolically significant, as a blind spot in art history. Severin, what would you say about that?
I just go on and say I think a great part of the show is that blind spot is being somewhat revealed. Later, we'll see
Mm,
people. We've already seen Sam Gilliam and Yankovic who use the canvas in a magnificent way and really expose it as material and as part of a craft. Some of the artists we'll see later don't even use a canvas at all and still manage to have
mm.
this canvas quality of fabric, substrate that is recognizable as a textile or a cloth. So I think it's a really great question you ask, and I think it's constantly being revealed
Mhm.
I
more
guess
and more.
just one other thing to say is that canvas is not a raw material. I
Right.
mean, hardly any materials are really raw, unless you're picking up a rock and doing something to it. But it's a highly, highly processed material, but we treat it as if it were neutral and almost treat it as a given. So, like, why don't we think of canvas as a Duchampian ready-made?
Mm.
And some artists, of course, have, and that's again a kind of implication of right checks practice, but the idea that you would want to understand canvas as an industrial or craft material that is part of the material complex that I was describing earlier, I think that's also important.
And maybe that's a good moment, Glenn, to continue your discussion of some of the textile artists that are included in this exhibition.
Sure. Yeah. So I alluded to this earlier. One thing that we were really keen to do is not reverse the polarity so much that textiles had no voice in the show and were only being treated as subject matter. And as I mentioned, there's been so much interest recently in fiber art and fiber artists, many of whom, the audience will be well aware of, like Annie Albers, Sheila Hicks, Lenore Tawney, people like that. So we wanted to, I suppose, register that important tradition and also think particularly about fiber artists working now who have something to say particular about painting so that it became a kind of bilateral conversation or multivalent conversation. So Elaine Rychek is really crucial to that conversation, partly because she's just been doing it for so long. This is a woman who went to Yale with, in the days of like Richard Serra and, after Eva Hesse was there, those kind of glory days, and has been an absolutely essential voice within the New York art world ever since. Very involved with the feminist art movement, again, not really part of the pattern and decoration movement that Severin mentioned earlier, but sort of one step outside it, and certainly very friendly with a lot of the figures that were in that movement, like Joyce Kozloff, for example, whose work is also, I think, very interesting to look at in relation to Paige Beavers, by the way. But another thing that is really important in Rychek's work is the idea that thread is also a way of making a drawing. So here she's doing this citational or quotational, somewhat postmodern practice of taking a motif from, an apex predator artist, Michelangelo, and almost clip arting it and helping herself to it, and then placing it on its own in this, again, this supposed void that's not a void because she's asserting the materiality of the canvas. And it's really interesting to note that this is something you can see other fiber artists doing as well. So less obviously here with this Adela Akers, but the idea of taking the idea of the drape that you might see in a painting or on a visit to the theater and turning it into this abstract motif that can then be woven, and you get this wonderful, almost ikat-like blur because of the way that the pre-dyed or pre-painted threads are woven into this composition. But maybe a more obvious comparison would be to the great California artist Leah Cook, who was long the head of the textiles program at the California College of the Arts, as it's now called. And this is a very similar thing to what Rychek is doing. So she's taking a passage from an Artemisia Gentileschi painting and recapitulating it in a combination of painting and weaving. And this is really one of those works in the show that you want to see in person. And even when you do see it in person, it's quite hard to figure out how she made it. But basically, what she did was to take painted strips and weave them together with textile threads and make this kind of matrix, this wobbly serpentine matrix. And somehow, out of that combination of materials, conjure the exact image of this piece of the Artemisia Gentileschi, which, just like the Rychek quotation, has this postmodern allusive, like allusive with an A, this referential relationship to its source. So really making explicit the kind of art historical trajectory that we were describing at the early part of the conversation. And then just wrapping up with a step into the contemporary moment, we're really pleased to have in the show this stunning work by Liz Collins, which, is one of the most visually powerful things she's made, which is saying a lot if you know her work, because she trades in visual power very reliably. And she's had an incredible year in 2025 because she was actually in that show I mentioned of Lynn Cook's that was at MoMA recently, but then also had a retrospective at the RISD Museum and then a one-person presentation at Art Basel. So she's a great example of one of the contemporary fiber artist who's getting a lot of attention at the moment. But what she's doing here is taking advantage of her extensive experience in industrial weaving. And she's actually effectively showing you the back of a woven textile and taking the floats, which are those unconnected lengths of thread that then drape down. Very interesting in relation to the Adela Akers, because you have this, again, an idea of natural draping, almost like those catenary works of Jasper Johns, the idea of a naturally formed curve, like a kind of self-generated geometry. But what she's doing is taking the floats that would normally be on the back of the work unseen, and she's using them almost as these kind of brush strokes or expressive mark making techniques. And if you know her work in other cases, she's used a combination of weaving and cutting, so construction and deconstruction, to produce similar effects of kind of hanging and, again, a very painterly effect, and made entirely, in her case, without paint. So we thought it was so interesting to kind of map these different positions, Rychek and Akers using entirely textile materials, but very much addressing paint as subject matter. Leah Cook using a combination of paint and weaving to remake a painting, and then Collins using threads to make what is, to all intents and purposes, pure painterly abstraction, with this incredible sense of energy to it as well. And then just as a kind of segue to the next bit of the conversation, which will be about the sculptural, I also did want to just mention that Suchitra Matai is, of course, a weaver of sorts, or at least an assemblage artist working in textile media. So though she presents in the exhibition as a sculptor, I would say, she's also clearly very informed by histories of textile making in India and elsewhere. So there's a kind of interesting, again, sort of Janus-faced or double quality to a lot of these works, and she's a good example of that.
Thank you, Glenn. And as we move into some of the sculptural responses, another question that I had for both of you, as I was walking through the shows yesterday, I was thinking a lot about how kineticism is inherent to
Mhm.
cloth, and the words drape and drop are themselves active ones. So many of these works, movement is either inherent or implied. And I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit as it relates to the works that are included in the show.
Yeah, Severin, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because the title of the exhibition itself, Drop Cloth, it's expressing movement. The cloth is being dropped, it always lands in a certain way. And so many of these works are sort of isolated snapshots. Because the one thing that you can't really see in painting or sculpture, but everyone captures in art, is how cloth is constantly moving, how it has an effect of kinetic energy. And I think it's fascinating to see how people try to freeze that in time. So many of these artists, in different ways, whether it be painting, some of the sculptural processes you're about to see, have captured that in their own unique way. And I feel it's just like using a different type of medium or a different type of pigment. It's how do you capture that feeling of kinetic energy in
Mm.
the work itself.
Yeah, I think also what's you said, Severin, about when you drop a cloth, it always lands in a certain way, but it's a kind of unreproducible
Mhm.
shape. So it's an infinite form generator. It makes you think about the relationship between the gravitational and the aleatory. It's one of those like fancy art history geek words, just means chance based or chance operations, random. And so you might think about a lineage from, let's say, um, Marcel Duchamp's standard stoppages, which are based on, dropping strings and mapping them and then using them as stencils, all the way through post-minimal artists like Eva Hesse, who I mentioned earlier in relation to Eileen Rychek, or a really important one for us would be Robert Morris and his felt works, where
Mhm.
he's making these slits and then allowing the felt to drop on the floor and take its own form. Barry LeVay would be another artist to mention there. So that whole lineage relies on cloth's ability to make itself, and the kinetic energy is, of course, to some extent, the energy of gravity making itself known. And it's almost like the artist is giving gravity a voice or giving it a form. And to some extent, it's a way, particularly with Duchamp and anybody who's sort of instructed by that set of gestures that he made, or anti-gestures, I want to call them. There's a kind of stepping away from authorship and letting the material do the work and letting the material assume its own form, which has to do, it's sort of bound up with the critique of authorship itself. And chance operations, therefore, has a kind of dialectical relationship to the idea of authorial control. And it's so interesting that fabric is so centrally involved in that storyline.
Thank you, Glenn. And now perhaps this is a good moment to move into some of those sculptural works that you've curated into the show.
I think it was a great question to talk about some of these sculptural works, as so many of them either capture that kinetic energy by force or let it happen, naturally. So we'll see a few examples. Maybe we could flip to the next slide.
Sure.
So I think Chellis Baird is a really wonderful artist who has a background in textiles. She received her BFA from RISD, specifically in textiles, and has a background in fashion. And she's a deep reverence for textile traditions. And I think in all of her work, this is a great example of an artist who likes for the kinetic energy to be known that emerges in fabric, likes movement to be seen, but there's a deep control about how it's laid out. Some of her other work, it goes as far as she weaves her own canvases. Back to the question you asked about the canvas as a structure or as a material. She is very in control of these materials and has a vision that she wants, not accidentally, but intentionally, to come out at the end of it. And this is just a great piece. It's also very recursive, and a lot of the conversations we've been having in terms of it's on canvas in a way. The material itself is a canvas, but it looks like a painting. It looks like a sculpture. And I think it brings together a lot of these ideas in a very, very exciting, kinetic way.
Mm.
I love this piece. I feel like this is such a distillation of all the concepts in the exhibition. Leslie Wayne has completely thrown the canvas out the window here. This is entirely made out of oil, out of pigment, and has a very trompe l'oeil, conceptual humor behind it that I think is great. Her entire paint rag series is depicting sort of the banal painter's rag in a studio in this vibrant, amazing, colorful way. And then again, there is a element of controlling the kinetic energy that would be in a drop cloth. Everything is meticulously formed. She has this paint skin method, but then molded. And there's very, I wouldn't say there's no chance operation allowed, but this another example for humor. I just love the title of this piece, pret-a-porter. It's a fashion term for ready-to-made fashion, and I love it. It almost takes on a human characteristic of this draped piece of fashion on what looks to be it seems this is the height of fashion, ready to be worn. It's just a really wonderful, humorous piece, and again, entirely out of pigment. Betty Woodman, I think she's fascinating. We spoke a little bit about the histories that went into curating this exhibition. And although Betty Woodman never thought she was part of the pattern decoration movement, she was definitely, parallel to it. And a lot of this pattern makings later in her career, she would go on to make some wonderful textile pieces in collaboration with the Fabric Workshop. Excuse me, it's obnoxious. But she very much did for ceramics what Sam Gilliam did for removing, allowing the canvas to become material itself. And so many of these artists in the pattern and decoration movements did for textiles and did for a lot of materials that were not considered fine art at the time. It was sort of a direct opposition to sort of the male-dominated minimalism and abstract domains. So I think she's a very important voice in the history and the ideas that brought about this exhibition.
Severin, can I just jump in there to point out one thing which you can see really well in the detail? And by the way, I think the last time I was on the New Social Environment, we were talking about the new Betty Woodman family residency, George and Betty Woodman family residency in Italy. So that's a nice point of continuity. But one thing that might not be immediately evident, particularly if you're not a ceramic artist, is that we've been talking a lot about form generation, but what Woodman would always do is start on the wheel. So even the flat elements that you see here are usually made on the wheel and then cut. And so when you look at them in detail, you see these incredible swirling movements in them, which is a very clay thing. But especially in a work like this, where you have a strong relationship to pattern making and the idea of a wall drape, you have this really interesting conversation happening between the motion, that kinetic energy in the clay, the implied kinetic energy that you would have in a textile, which of course is not present, and then the gestural quality you have in painting, which she's doing with these alternative materials of slip and glaze. So very complicated way around some of the other um, vectors that we've been talking about with these other artists.
In a similar vein, Anna Fasshauser's also in opposition to sort of the minimalists and maximalists of the second half of the 20th century. So I feel a little guilty now for including John Chamberlain earlier. But I think, again, it just speaks to how this concept of drop cloth can be seen. There's no hierarchy of genres or movements. It's just a present force in every movement. It's interesting to see how it reflects. But this is a work made out of aluminum and industrial paints. What I find especially fascinating about Anna Fasshauer, she does everything with the weight of her body. So in a way, it becomes sort of an extension of herself, almost a self-portrait style piece. It's created to the ability and dimensions of her height, her weight, her ability to move this metal around. And it's just a beautiful work of, again, there's pleats, there's drapes, there's folds, but it is material that we have not yet discussed.
I also love that it's called flag, Severin. So
Mm-hmm.
again, implies the quality of identity formation, perhaps like almost like a personal emblem or form of alternative abstract self-portraiture.
Absolutely. Kennedy Yanko. So similarly to the Leslie Waynes we spoke about earlier, Kennedy Yanko has this amazing signature move called the paint skin. So what you're looking at here is, well, first I'll talk about the steel armature that this paint skin is draped over. They're all found objects. She goes to scrap yards, and there's sort of a recycled attitude about finding the armature where she then drapes the paint skin. The paint skin itself is a pigment. I forget the exact process, but she makes these huge tarp-like pigment baths. And as they're still malleable and forming, she'll manipulate them and drape them. And again, it's capturing that kinetic energy and forcing it into a certain shape. And there's, I'm sure, some natural folding that goes on and some very intentional figural ideas that go on. I again see this almost as a figurative work because she's draping these steel armatures almost as if it's clothing, almost as if it's an extension to a body of some kind. But just a wonderful use of material. And again, tying together a lot of the concepts and themes we spoke about when looking at the Chamberlain earlier, when looking at the Leslie Wayne, and just incredible sculptural piece. This is a wall relief. So we had two works of hers, one at Susan's gallery and one at the Hollis Taggart Gallery. But I think, again, just a really great way to sum up a lot of the ideas in the exhibition.
Right. And as I recall, I think this one is the one that is hanging at Susan's gallery. And I thought maybe we could bring her into the conversation since we're happy and lucky to have her with us today to talk about some of the certain works from the artists that Inglett Gallery represents.
When Glenn invited me to participate in this show, I said, I have the perfect piece for you based on the premises. It actually has curtain in the title. And it's Beverly Sims' Bow or Bow Blue Curtain, which consists of a series of or chorus line of Cinderella dresses that are pinned at the waistline so the bodice flips over to form the swags on the stage curtain. So it speaks to Glenn and Severin's ideas of curtain or drape with the ability to both hide and to then reveal. But also thinking about the work as a feminist intervention. The dresses obviously stand-ins for the body. But even the title, bow and bow, these women, are they bowing to the audience or are they bowed by the burden that they carry? And I'm also loving the blue tulle because anyone who's ever worn a Cinderella dress or a tutu knows that while it's beautiful and elegant material that she's chosen, it's actually really brutal to wear. So, so there's a lot of dualities in Beverly's work, and even right down to the title of this piece, whether it's pronounced bow or bow. And then I was going to jump to Greg Smith's work because they share some materiality with Beverly's work and the use of
Although,
the tool.
Susan, can I just mention, because you're being too
Yes.
polite to do it, but your next show is actually a solo exhibition of
It is,
Beverly.
thank you. And I should also mention that Beverly's doing the Woodman Foundation
Oh,
residence.
great. Okay.
Yes, this spring. So lots of good
Wonderful.
tie-ins.
Nice confluence there.
Yeah. All one big family. And then I was going to jump to Greg Smith's work real quick because he's also using blue tulle in his pieces. So if you don't mind jumping the slide and coming back.
Yeah.
Thanks. But Greg is doing for the Greg Smith.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Okay.
sorry. Here we
Yeah,
go.
it's
Yeah,
okay.
there we go. Yeah.
It has created a series of banners that are banners, and well, there's certainly a history of banners in art, whether it's religious or secular processions, but also in terms of advertising and text-based sloganeering. And so you can actually see text in this banner that's been excised from the blue tulle. And that tool is reified in the jacket that's hanging in the lower right. That's actually a jacket that's made out of a screen mesh. So very, if you think tulle is brutal, screen mesh is really a hair shirt of a jacket. The text here is unreadable because it's been excised, but it's really illegible because it's a text that's coming from a language that was created by a sovereign citizen by the name of David Wynne Miller. He was constantly losing court cases, and instead of blaming his faulty logic, he blamed legalese and so created his own language. And this is written in that language. There are very few vowels and very weird punctuation, so it didn't win him any cases. But it does speak to this idea, which Greg is talking about in this body of work in the series before, about the inefficiencies of language to fully communicate the whole of human experience. But whether you know any of this or not, it adds to the experience, but to see the work is really amazing. And I'm just going to read real quickly the list of fabrics and materials that he's used to create this collage. The medium list reads canvas, acrylic, polyester, organza, tulle, polyester thread, aluminum, fiberglass screen, rocks, bricks, encaustic, graphite, EMT2, HDPE sheet, polyester sheet, cotton paper, wood, and dirt. So this is a testament to the way, to creativity and to the artist imagination. And then jumping back to Martha Jackson Jarvis, she also is just really magical in her use of the entire toolbox. Incredibly bold in the way she makes these large scale, I would call them tapestries. They're attached at the top and they hang free flowing. And they're abstract landscapes. But she's using the whole toolbox. You see bits of drawing and printmaking, painting, collage. The central piece comes off the canvas. And it's just really, they're amazing objects to be seen. And when I saw her solo show at the Baltimore Museum of Art a couple of years ago, I just sat in the gallery because I understood what these abstract landscapes were. I could place myself in the light and the materials because she's basically traced a path through the South that was taken by a distant relative who served in the Black militia in the Revolutionary War. And so you could really feel it in these works. But I think about them as tapestries, as abstract or imaginary landscapes that take us back to medieval Renaissance tapestries with everything but the unicorn. But again, I would encourage you all to see these shows because this work really, all of it needs to be seen in person. That's the way art should be seen.
I agree. There is something very magical about walking through both of these exhibitions. And to that end, I encourage everybody to attend the walkthrough this weekend with Severin and Glenn at both galleries, beginning at 11 a.m. at Susan Inglett Gallery. And with that, I think maybe it's time for us to take some questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you all so much for such a wonderful conversation. To our audience members, there is a link in the chat if you have a question for a guest. You can submit your question there and we will turn to you shortly. The first question comes from Shellis Baird, and Shellis says, Glenn, you mentioned pattern as something artists return to because it distorts, amplifies, and multiplies, especially in relation to textiles. I've been thinking about pattern as a kind of trustworthy data, something learned through
Mm,
repetition and the body. Do you think
mm,
pattern offers a form of comfort or stability, something we can trust for the artist and the viewer, even as the work may visually seem complex?
That's such a beautiful idea. I guess the thing that occurs to me is that um, of course it's both comfort and it's also disruption. And even in a funny way, it's a kind of teleportation. There's an idea from the work of Deleuze and Guattari, who talk about um, well, it's part of their conversation about rhizomic connections. If people have read that kind of, it's like heavy duty theory, but the basic idea is very simple, which is that the space of textiles allows you to make connections in a very immediate and very open way because you can take any 2 points of cloth and touch them together. It's sometimes used by like science fiction geeks as a metaphor for how like wormhole teleportation could work, like in Star Trek. So you can just take any 2 points of the terrain and put them in contact with one another. So the fact that textile has both that rigorous, repetitious pattern that might make us think about, the artists of the Gestalt movement or other modernist abstract artists who are really trying to lay down the law and, think of the grid as this kind of self-reinforcing, self-propagating system, but that it would also have this radically asystematic quality that has to do with a kind of infinity of possibilities and infinity of different connections, rhizomic connections. I think that's maybe one reason why it has this very strong set of formal possibilities built into it because it has that sense of internal opposition. So I would say kind of yes to the idea of reliability or comfort or a kind of almost like a kind of visual reassurance because of its predictability and its extension. It can be run off of looms yard after yard after yard forever. And yet, as Severin and I were talking about earlier, there's also the unique, unrepeatable clump or crumple that happens when you drop the cloth, and both of those things are happening in the same material.
Thank you for that answer, Glenn, and thank you for that question, Chalice. The next question is from Liz Collins, and Liz says, I always think of several of the artists connected to Art Povera as artists who were working with textiles with great focus in the realm of canvas manipulation related to things you have mentioned, like George Ellison, Lucio Fontana, Salvatore Scarpita, and sorry, like George Ellison, Lucio Fontana, Salvatore Scarpita, and embroidery without any sort of acknowledgments of this fact. Do you all have any thoughts about this? I would be curious to hear your perspectives.
Hmm. Severin, Susan, you want to take on Art de Povera?
I think maybe you're best suited for that, Glenn.
I mean, I can take a shot of it at it. I was thinking, of course, of Alighiero Boetti, who does those amazing maps and uh, letter pieces that are made by, I think, Afghani artisans that he drafted into the project. So he would be another example. Alberto Berri, who worked with scorched burlap, would be another example. Um, and I think Liz is right to point to that moment. Really, it's the Italian equivalent to the post-minimal or processed art um, material that we were talking about earlier, the Eva Hesse, Robert Morris moment. And it has a similar quality of, finding the form through the
Is Glenn also frozen for you all?
Italian.
Oh, he's back.
One thing we maybe haven't talked about enough is that textile obviously is also soft and fragile. It's super strong. So, try to rip a cloth with your bare hands if you can, and have this incredible tensile strength, but also can be pierced very easily and torn. And it shows where, in fact, there's a show right now on at the Barbican here in London, which is about dirt and effectively material trauma as preserved in garments. And the fact that cloth therefore has that potential to show, you know, the histories of violence, maybe even class asymmetries because of wear. That's also really built into it. And I think that that's something you find more in the arte povera tradition than you do in the more abstraction oriented New York post-minimalism tradition that is sort of its geographical equivalent. It was a great question, Liz. Thanks.
Thank you for that answer, Glenn. Our last question is going to come from Joshua. I'll give Joshua a chance to unmute.
Hi, everyone. My question is about sort of the constant with the works that are on the wall, this sort of constant presence of gravity, and you sort of feel that and how it's contained in the weight of the drapes and the folds. Because I also know that with textiles, not only they can be quite stubborn materials in terms of how they fold or maybe what shapes they form and how irreproducible they can be. And so my question is or is in regards to sort of any challenges you may have faced in installing any of these works, and how you sort of thought about that going into it.
There were a variety of challenges. I think a really interesting discovery we made while hanging the Sam Gilliam is that there are no formal instructions for Sam Gilliam drape pieces at all. There is one central holding divot, and the rest is entirely up to interpretation. So altogether with our art handlers, there's pictures, there's historical documentation, but a lot of it is that accidental letting gravity do the work and just providing a guiding hand and seeing where the piece wants to take itself in a way. I find that quite beautiful. It becomes more of a piece of music or a dance, something that is experienced only for the moment that it's happening, and then it's an entirely new piece or experience the next time you witness it. What's a little concerning is there are a lot of tiny holes in the edges of these Sam Gilliam drape pieces for every time it's been put up on a wall. Most of them we reused. In our case, we were very archival, very careful about reusing all these holes. But I think because of this interpretive nature of hanging the piece, there will be a lot of painter's nails that go into this, and it will slowly erode over time until there's just a little nub of what's left. So maybe some archivist or expert on the subject can take note and preserve these pieces in some way moving forward. But I think it was fascinating to see sort of the accidental, again, to the questions we were talking about earlier, whether gravity does the work or it's the artist's hand does the work, or something like the Kennedy Yanko, which is that work has already been done, guided by the artist. You receive it and put it on display, and that's the end of it. But those are kind of the two extremes, I would say, in terms of challenges.
Thank you for that question, Joshua. And that concludes our Q&A. We're going to turn over to Jessica, who is going to close us out with a couple of readings.
So we have two short readings to close with today. The first one is a diary entry, which Glenn or Severin, maybe you just want to give a quick little background to the audience before I read it from Rosemary Mayer.
Yeah, so we see Rosemary Mayer here on the right, and this is from a translation that she did of the diaries of Jacopo Pontormo, the Renaissance, or maybe better said, Mannerist artist, who is one of the most exquisite and exuberant portrayers of fabrics of that time. Perfect example of somebody who captured the diaphanous and polychrome possibilities of fabric that Severin was talking about earlier. And so this is not from Pontormo's diary itself. This is from something that she wrote as a kind of prefatory statement to her translation of it.
And it reads, he made himself a static, withdrawn life, made convoluted floating work. He used his diary to know which days were past, what foods had kept him well enough to work. A thing to hold on to the way kids hold balloons, but not like the balloons, like the tension in the hand that holds the cord, wraps it around a few fingers, or the spread of joints where the hand and fingers meet. There are children who think that you can disappear with floating balloons. And then to end, we are going to close with He Wishes for the Cloths of Heaven by W.B. Yeats, because it just seemed metaphorically like a nice ending point here. I had the heavens embroidered cloths and wrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half light. I would spread the cloths under your feet, but I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was a beautiful way to close us out. Thank you, Glenn, Severin, Susan, and Jessica. Thank you, Emily and Aga from Hollis Taggart for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these weekday conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tonight, we hope you'll join us at Industry City in Sunset Park for our winter issue celebration from 6 to 8. And if you're free on Tuesday as well, join us at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Alejandro Cartagena and Charlotte Kent on the event of Alejandro Cartagena Ground Rules on view at SF MoMA. And as is Rail tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all again so much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Glenn.
Glenn.
Thank you, Severin.
All right, thank you.
Susan. Thank you,
Thank
Jess.
you, Severin and
Thanks,
Glenn.
everybody.
Jessica.
Amazing talk.
Thank you, Severin.
That was amazing.
Thank you, Jess.
Great.
Bye.
Brilliant.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.